Since you've clicked on today's video, I'm assuming that you're interested in getting involved in the Shadowhunter universe, or maybe you've already read one of the series or the books from this universe, and now you're realizing that there's actually a lot more to it and you have no idea where to go from here. So that is where I come in, and I'm going to share with you a couple of options of how you can go about reading all of the books in this universe, because I know it could be extremely intimidating if you are not very familiar with what all of these books are about, because there are currently 20 books out in this universe. There is 4 completed series that can technically all be read on their own, but also interconnect and span over the course of hundreds of years. And then on top of that, you also have 3 collections of short story books, as well as 1 incompleted series that is kind of considered a spin-off series. And then you also have 1 series that is currently not out, but has already been announced that will be a thing one day. So we're just patiently waiting for some information on it. So I'm really not surprised that you're overwhelmed and have no idea where to go from here, because it can be extremely confusing if you don't really know what all of these books are about. So in today's video, I'm going to share with you what every series is about, and then I'm going to be giving you a couple of options of how you can go about reading it. And why I'm giving you a couple of options is because there is no right or wrong way to go about this. Any way you choose to do this is a totally fine way. But I have read all of the books in this universe twice now, minus the first one, which I've only read once because it just came out and I haven't had a chance to read it twice yet. But I do think that there are some ways to go about this that are better ways than others. They all have some pros and cons to it, but I think that, you have to choose one way. So I'm going to give you some options on which ways I think are the best ways. So we do have a lot to get through. So let's get started. So just in case you're not familiar with the Shadowhunter universe at all, let me give you a quick rundown of what you can expect from all of the books and series in this universe before we actually get started in talking about what order you should actually read them in. So the Shadowhunter universe is a young adult urban fantasy series, universe, whatever it is you want to call it, written by Cassandra Clare. So urban fantasy basically means that it is taking place in our real world, in places that us as humans are very familiar with, except there's a fantastical element woven on top of it. So in this universe, you're following Shadowhunters, which are demon hunting warriors who are going to protect humankind from the entire downworld. So the downworld consists of Shadowhunters, as in angel-blessed demon hunting warriors, as well as, let's say, warlocks and vampires and werewolves and fairies and demons and a lot of other magical creatures, everything basically that you can possibly think of. And in this universe, in all of the series in general, you're going to be following a handful of characters that are all going to be fighting demons, starting wars, having politics of sorts. There's going to be romances, there's going to be friendships. It's a very classic urban fantasy sort of series, but happens to be they all interconnect and there's a lot of stuff going on. So that is more or less the gist of what you can expect from all of the books in this universe. And with that said, let's get into what all the series are and what order you should actually read them in. The first order that I wanted to recommend to you happens to be my personally preferred reading order. This is the order that I chose to read it the first time that I got involved in the universe, and I'm very happy that I did it that way. And that order is chronologically. And the reason why I chose to do it this way is because I really wanted to read it like a history book. At the end of the day, all these series, while they can be read at by themselves, they also do interconnect and they span over the course of hundreds of years. And I really wanted to read it in the order that it happened in this fictional world, even though it wasn't necessarily the order that I was actually written in. Plus, if you think about it, you can't be majorly spoiled for anything that hasn't technically happened yet. So I figured it was a really good way to go about it, and I'm very happy that I did it that way. So with that said, the first series chronologically is the Infernal Devices series, which is Clockwork Angel, Clockwork Prince, and Clockwork Princess. And these books are technically considered historical fantasies because they do take place in 1878, in the Victorian era, Victorian period, whatever it is you want to call it, in London. So they do have a very historical, olden day feeling to it. And in these books, you are following a girl named Tessa, who at the beginning of the first book, she ends up getting kidnapped by some of the downworld. The Shadowhunters are going to come and have to save her, but she had no idea that any of this exists. She thought she was just living in a normal, regular world with no magic and no Shadowhunters. And so while you are following her journey of whatever it is that she's going to go through throughout this series, you also get to learn about this universe with her. So it's a great introduction into the universe because you get to learn about the Shadowhunters and everything that you need to know about this universe while she is learning it herself. And then you're also going to get to follow a lot of romances, and there's going to be politics, there's going to be war, there's going to be a lot of stuff going on. But more or less, that is the gist of this first series. And the only thing to note about it, if you are going to do it this way, is that technically the epilogue for Clockwork Princess is a minor spoiler for something that's going to happen in one of the later series in this universe. I personally think it's really not a big deal, and I still would recommend reading in this order, but we'll talk about it a little more when I get to that next book. So next up, you have the Last Hour series, which is Chain of Gold, Chain of Iron, and then Chain of Thorns. So this is still technically considered a historical fantasy because it only takes place around 20 or so years after the Infernal Devices series. We're now in 1903. We're still set in London, but it's now, I think, the Edwardian period, the Edwardian era. Don't take my word for that. But either way, you're actually following all of the children from the Infernal Devices series. Like at the end of the series, you get to find out who couples up with each other, and now they're all going to have children, and now it's a bunch of years later, their children are grown, and they're all going to be going through their own adventures, having their own romances, dealing with their own issues, and everything along those lines. So happens to be, this is probably the most character-driven series out of all of the series in the universe because you are following so many characters, so many different dynamics and things along those lines. I mean, at the end of the day, I believe you have at least 11 main characters in this series, and then you also get to see little snippets of all of the characters from the Infernal Devices series because that's their parents, and they obviously show up here and there. And so there's a lot of stuff going on. I will just point out right now, this is my least favorite series from the universe, but if you were going to read it chronologically, this is the spot that you would read this series in. Next up, you've got the Mortal Instruments series, which is a collection of 6 books. So it's City of Bones, City of Ashes, City of Glass, City of Fallen Angels, City of Lost Souls, and then City of Heavenly Fire. And this is now jumping 100 years in the timeline. So it's currently 2007. We're in New York City, and you're following this girl named Clary Fairchild, who one day goes to a nightclub with one of her friends and ends up seeing some Shadowhunter business go down. But like I think I said before, humans can't see anything Shadowhunter related. So once she goes and confronts them, being like, what the hell is going on? They realize that she can see them. So they end up pulling her into the Shadowhunter universe. And then you're going to get to learn all about the Shadowhunter universe again through her eyes as she's learning it. There's going to be romances. There's going to be a lot of friendships, a lot of politics, a lot of wars, things along those lines. But that is more or less the gist of this series. And it's kind of very similar to the Infernal Devices, where you have another main character who was unaware of the Shadowhunter universe in general. So you kind of get to learn about the entire world with her as she's learning it. So it's another great way to be introduced into the universe, and happens to be, it was actually the first book ever written in this universe, and it was actually only supposed to be a trilogy. It was only supposed to be City of Bones, City of Ashes, and then City of Glass. So happens to be at the end of City of Glass, you do get a very satisfying ending because it was supposed to end there. But later on, she decided to continue on with these characters specifically and this spot in the timeline, and she ended up giving them a second issue to deal with, and that is what the later 3 books are. So it could kind of be read as a part 1 and a part 2, and that is why if you are going to read it chronologically, I recommend to pause after part 1 and stick in the Red Scrolls of Magic right here, because that is when this book takes place chronologically. So the Red Scrolls of Magic is the first book in the Eldest Curses series, and it's kind of like a spin-off from the Mortal Instruments series or just the Shadowhunter universe in general. But in this book specifically, you are following Magnus and Alec, who are 2 main characters from the Mortal Instruments series, as they go on their little side mission, just the 2 of them, because you find out that Magnus actually had started a cult a couple hundred years ago that he was unaware of, and now he's got to go deal with it. And happens to be, Magnus is one of my favorite characters from the entire universe. I absolutely love it. And he happens to be a warlock. So he is immortal, and therefore he has lived for hundreds of years. So he actually shows up in every single book in the Shadowhunter universe. In the Mortal Instruments series, he's one of the main characters, but in all the other series, he's kind of like a side character that just comes in and out. So you really get to see a lot of him. And this is more or less a side story that's just about him and Alec, who you will meet in the Mortal Instruments series. So technically, since this takes place right in between the 2 books, I do recommend just pausing right after City of Glass, because you do get a very satisfying ending and you're not itching to move on to the next half of this series. Read this little short story here and then move on to the second half of the Mortal Instruments. And then happens to be, remember when I was talking about the Infernal Devices, I said a little bit of something about how the epilogue of Clockwork Princess does have a little bit of a spoiler thing going on with another book later on in the series. Well, this is where I was talking about. So happens to be in the last book in the Mortal Instruments series, in City of Heavenly Fire, you do find something out that ends up happening before the epilogue of Clockwork Princess. So technically, if you did want to read this 100% chronologically, when you're reading the Infernal Devices, I recommend not reading the epilogue, reading all up to City of Heavenly Fire, finish City of Heavenly Fire, and then you can jump back to the epilogue of Clockwork Princess. I don't think that it's really a huge deal. You really don't have to do this, but technically, if you wanted to be 100% perfect about it, that is what you should do, because technically that's the order in how things happen. Next up, up, you have Tales from the Shadowhunter Academy, which is the first book that's a collection of short stories. So I like to consider this book as an extended epilogue to the Mortal Instruments series, because you are following one of the main characters after the events of the Mortal Instruments series as he decides to go to the Shadowhunter Academy to become a Shadowhunter himself. I don't want to give away any spoilers, so I'm not going to say anything more than that, but this is a collection of short stories that more or less does span the course of 2008 to 2010 as you're following him in his journey of becoming a Shadowhunter. But because it is a collection of short stories, it does also have a couple of short stories that does take place in the past. So I believe the first short story started in like 1888 or something like that, and you do get to see some of the characters from, let's say, like the Infernal Devices series as well as the Last Hour series as they had attended the Shadowhunter Academy themselves and went through some, things that they were going through. So it is a great book to read, even though it's not necessarily mandatory to read because it's not really a part of a series. I do think that it should be considered a mandatory read, especially as just like an extended epilogue to the Mortal Instruments series. I really do think you're missing out if you decide to overlook this book, and it is one of my favorite books from the entire Shadowhunter universe. Like, out of all 20 books, this is probably like one of my top 3 books out of all of them. So I really do not recommend overlooking this book, and this is where you should read it in the timeline. So here's where I tricked you a little bit, / it kind of just like gets slightly confusing, and that's because the next book up that I would recommend reading chronologically is the Bane Chronicles. So this is another collection of short stories where you're following Magnus Bane throughout the years. I already introduced you to him before. He is the warlock that shows up in every single book in this universe because he is immortal. So this is a collection of short stories that spans over the course from like 1791 all the way up until 2007, and you get to see some moments in his life when he was dealing with certain things, going through certain situations, and it kind of does add a little bit of extra context to some of the other things that has happened so far in this universe. So again, I don't really think that this is necessarily worth not reading, worth overlooking, even though it isn't my favorite book from the entire universe. Like, some of the stories I just didn't really care too much about, but I still think that they're definitely worth the read overall because it's Magnus and he's one of my favorite characters of all time, and it really does add a little bit of extra context as to who he is as a person, as well as some other things that end up happening throughout the rest of the series. But why I said this was a little bit confusing is because the last short story in this book specifically does take place at the same time as something that happens in the last book of the Mortal Instruments series. Like, there is a moment that happens, and then the last short story is that moment from Magnus's point of view. So technically, the ending of the Bane Chronicles ends at the same time as the Mortal Instruments series. So technically, according to the timeline, a lot of people would say to read the Bane Chronicles before Tales from the Shadowhunter Academy, except like I had already said, I really like to think of Tales from the Shadowhunter Academy as an extended epilogue to the Mortal Instruments series. So I really prefer to go straight into Tales from the Shadowhunter Academy right after the Mortal Instruments series, and that is why I stick in the Bane Chronicles right here. So technically, these are easily interchangeable. You can read whichever one in whatever order you want, but if you were going to ask me, I say read the Bane Chronicles after Tales from the Shadowhunter Academy. And then here is where you're going to want to read The Lost Book of the White, which is the second book in the Eldest Curses series. So this is another short story about Magnus and Alec as they have to go on their own adventure and deal with their own little issue that they're having, and it technically takes place in 2010. And this is one reason why I feel very strongly about reading this chronologically, because there are some events that happen in Tales from the Shadowhunter Academy. There's like a couple of short stories where then it ends up correlating to The Lost Book of the White. Like, at the beginning of The Lost Book of the White, those moments from Tales from the Shadowhunter Academy had already happened. So if you had skipped Tales from the Shadowhunter Academy, then all of a sudden you're going to be like, well, how did they get here? I know it's been a couple of years, but I feel like I missed something. So that is why I feel so strongly of, again, reading the Tales from the Shadowhunter Academy, because there's such important stuff that happened in that book that ends up, being mentioned again later on in the universe. And that is why, if you're going to read The Lost Book of the White, read it right here, because according to the timeline, this is where it happens. And then the last completed series, according to the timeline, is the Dark Artifices series, which is Lady Midnight, Lord of Shadows, and Queen of Air and Darkness. So these books take place in 2012, and they're based in Los Angeles, but happens to be all of the main characters from this series you originally got to meet at the end of the Mortal Instruments series, because at that time, they were dealing with a war, and there were obviously some casualties, and some of the casualties happened to have been the parents from the main characters of the Dark Artifices series. So at that time, you kind of got to meet them when they were all younger, and a really big traumatic event was happening in their life, and all of a sudden everything was changing for them. So you kind of originally get introduced to them and where their story starts at the end of the Mortal Instruments series, and then all of a sudden 5 or so years later they end up getting their own series. So in this series, one of the main characters is Emma Carstairs, and her parents were one of the casualties in the war that was taking place at the end of the Mortal Instruments series, and she always thought that her parents weren't actually killed as part of the war, but that somebody actually murdered them, and it was just like a cover-up at the time. So she has always been on a hunt to try to find out who their murderer was. was. And at the beginning of this series, she ends up finding a little bit of a lead as to who it can possibly have been. So that is more or less where the story starts off, and you're going to end up going on a journey of her trying to figure out, who had murdered her parents. And it's going to go much further than that, but that's kind of the gist of where it ends up starting out. And happens to be, this is my favorite series out of all the series in the Shadowhunter universe. It has my favorite romance, it has my favorite plotline, it has my favorite characters. Overall, just my favorite, and it is so satisfying to get the best series all the way at the end. But happens to be, before you are done with the entire Shadowhunter universe, you do have one more collection of short stories that you have to read, which is a Ghost from the Shadow Market. And in this book in general, you are following Gem, who is one of the main characters from the Infernal Devices series. And I really don't want to give away any spoilers whatsoever, so I'm just going to leave it at that and say that this happens to be one of my favorite books from the entire universe, alongside with Tales from the Shadowhunter Academy. So I highly do not recommend skipping over this book, especially because not only does it have some amazing short stories, but the last short story in this collection of short stories does give you a little bit of a hint as to where the next series in this universe is going to be going, which is going to be the Wicked Power series. So at the time that I'm making this video, we don't have any information whatsoever on the Wicked Powers, but because of that short story, we actually do know who the main characters are going to be and a little bit about where that series can potentially go. So again, I don't want to give away any spoilers whatsoever, but I will say that it is very important to read It Goes from the Shadow Market, especially before you end up reading the Wicked Power series. So that is all for the chronological order for the entire Shadowhunter universe. So let's move on to my second option of an order. Next, I wanted to share with you publication order, which is a very valid way for going about reading this universe. It's also a very traditional way of going about it, because at the end of the day, this is the way that the series was literally written. This is the way that the books came out if you were having kept up with them since the beginning and you were slowly reading them throughout the years as one book came out at a time. So that order is to first start with the Mortal Instruments series, which is City of Bones, City of Ashes, and then City of Glass. And then happens to be right after that, she started writing the Infernal Devices series. So the first book, which was Clockwork Angel, came out, and then she continued on with the Mortal Instruments series and she started writing City of Fallen Angels. And then after she finished that book, she jumped back to Infernal Devices, wrote the second book, which is Clockwork Prince, then wrote the next book in Mortal Instruments series, which is City of Lost Souls, then finished up with the Infernal Devices, wrote Clockwork Princess, and then finished Mortal Instruments series and wrote City of Heavenly Fire. So what's funny is, if you remember, I had said that the last two books in the Infernal Devices and the Mortal Instruments series have that spoilery thing going on. So even if you did read it in publication order, you still can't really easily get around that whole epilogue spoilery thing that's happening. So I just wanted to point that out, that even in this order, you still have that little issue going on. But anyway, after that, the Bane Chronicles came out, then Tales from the Shadowhunter Academy, and then the entire Dark Artifices series. So Lady Midnight, Lord of Shadows, and Queen of Air and Darkness. And then after that was the Red Scrolls of Magic, and then Ghost from the Shadow Market, then Chain of Gold, which is the first book in the Last Hour series, but then the Lost Book of the White, and then the last two books in the Last Hour series, which is Chain of Iron and Chain of Thorns. So this is the full collection of how you would read it if you were going to go publication order. And the only real downside that I see with this is that you don't get to binge every single series. Like, for example, the Infernal Devices is split up with the later half of the Mortal Instruments series because that's the way that it ended up being published. And then same with the Last Hour series, you have the Lost Book of the White in between book 1 and book 2. And I personally am just a really big binger. I really like getting invested in a story, getting invested in a set of characters, and reading their entire series all back to back. So that is why this order wouldn't personally work for me. But if you don't really mind not binging series, then this is a really good way to go about reading the Shadowhunter universe. And then the last order that I want to recommend to you is actually another very valid way of going about reading this series. It's actually the way that Cassandra Clare herself, the author of this universe, recommends reading her series if you're just starting from the beginning and you're now coming in when all of these books are already out. And she recommends, by again starting with the Mortal Instruments series, which is City of Bones, City of Ashes, and City of Glass, because this is the best and correct way to be introduced to the universe. So she recommends to start there. And then after that, she recommends recommends to stick in the Red Scrolls of Magic because, like I had told you before, this book technically takes place right after the third book in the Mortal Instruments series. So she recommends reading it right here and then jumping into the Infernal Devices series. But you still do have that whole epilogue issue with the Mortal Instruments series because even she does recommend to read the last 3 books in the Mortal Instruments series after the Infernal Devices series. So if you were going to do that, then, you still have that whole issue thing that you're dealing with. So really, this entire video did not help you whatsoever with that one spoiler that happens to span over all 3 of these options that I'm giving you. So I guess maybe it's really not a big deal because all these options seem to have it and everybody seems to be totally fine. So anyway, after that, you again have the Bane Chronicles and Tales from the Shadowhunter Academy in the same way that the publication order has it because that's the way that it was published. And then she recommends for you to read The Lost Book of the White because remember when I told you in chronological order that you really should read Tales from the Shadowhunter Academy before The Lost Book of the White because it has a lot of stuff that correlates to each other. So this is actually not a bad way of going about it because it would be really nice to read these books back to back so that the Magnus and Alex storyline is very fresh in your brain when you're going from one book to the other. But anyway, after that, she recommends to read the Dark Artifices series, so Lady Midnight, Lord of Shadows, Queen of Air and Darkness, and then to jump into Ghosts of the Shadow Market. And then all the way at the end, she does recommend to read the spin-off series from the Infernal Devices series, which is the Last Hour series. So Chain of Gold, Chain of Iron, and Chain of Thorns. And even though I did not really see where she specifically recommended this, so I don't know if this is her reasoning why, but because I have read both, like all of the series in the universe, my thought as to why she recommends to read this series last, even though it is the most recent series that was published in the universe. So it does make sense still, like if you're going to go publication date or whatever like that whole thing is because I do think that the Last Hour series does correlate to the Dark Artifices series. And I wouldn't say that information in the Last Hour series per se has spoilers for the Dark Artifices series, but I do think that there is some connections there that you really like. I don't know which way would be better to go about reading them. So I do understand why some people would say to first read the Dark Artifices series and then read the Last Hour series, and then you will understand some motives for some of the characters in the Dark Artifices series when you get to see the origin of where some of those storylines has started. So again, I am so sorry if that confused you because it's really hard to tell you anything without giving you spoilers, but I do think that that is the reason why she probably recommends reading the Last Hour series all the way at the end. And then the only other thing that I can possibly think of as to why this would probably be a good way to go about it is because in Ghosts from the Shadow Market and then Tales from the Shadowhunter Academy, the collection of 2 short stories, you actually do get to see some short stories about some of the characters from the Last Hour series before the Last Hour series actually starts. And it actually kind of introduces you to some of those main characters and kind of shows you where they started and how they became the people that they were at the beginning of the Last Hour series. And happens to be, I really don't think it's a big deal to see the origin before you actually get into their series because you get to learn them in their moment. And then later on, if you were to read it chronologically, you would get to just like, see afterwards. It's like, oh, that's how they became who they were. So it's not necessarily a spoiler because everything that you learn in the short stories, you will later learn again in the Last Hour series. But technically, all of those short stories were written first. So those were the first introductions to these characters when the entire Shadowhunter universe was written. So technically, if you wanted to be introduced to every character in the way that it was written, you would go about reading these short story books first and then reading the Last Hour series. So that's probably another reason why she ended up putting the Last Hour series last. So with that said, I've decided to change my mind and I actually have one more order that I want to share with you before I let you guys go. So the last order that I want to recommend to you is to actually mix together order number 1 and order number 3 by taking the basis of reading it chronologically, but also taking Cassandra Clare's recommendation of reading the Last Hour series all the way at the end because of all the reasons we just discussed about the Dark Artifices series and the 2 short stories. And I do think that going about it this way might be the best of both worlds because like I originally told you, I'm a really big stickler for reading things the way that it happened. And I happen to think that, first of all, because the Last Hour series is my least favorite series from the entire universe, I don't really have a huge attachment to it, and I don't really per se care to, read it right after you got to read the Infernal Devices series, which is about their parents. I do think that it is kind of fun to read both of those back to back because you're really living in the historical moments, you're really living in the world, and that's why it's a fine way to read it, all the way at the beginning, but also, it's really not a huge deal to not read it right then, and then after you get all of the, introductions to these characters, you can just stick in the Last Hour series and read it all all the way at the end of the timeline, even though it technically does take place second spot in the timeline. So hopefully that wasn't too confusing, but I do think that if you like the idea of reading it chronologically, but also you really do want to be introduced to all the characters in the way that it was originally happening as all the books came out, this would be a really, really solid way to go about it. So with that said, I think that that is all of the options of what I wanted to give you of how you can possibly go about reading the Shadowhunter universe. You've got chronological order, which is my personal preferred way of reading it, but then you also have order number 4, which is chronological with a twist, which is again, kind of just as good of a way of going about it. Then you also have publication order, and then you've also got Cassandra Clare's recommended reading order. So any way that you choose to go about reading this universe is a totally fine way for doing it. There is no right or wrong answer. These are just some options that would probably give you the best experience in my personal opinion. But with that said, that is everything that I wanted to share with you for today's video. So I really do hope that I answered all of the questions that you might have had when you're looking to get involved in the Shadowhunter universe. I hope that I made it as simple and easy as possible to understand all of the information that I gave you. I know that it was a lot, and I know that could be very confusing and very intimidating, but I really do hope that you now understand a little bit more of what you're getting into. But if for some reason you still have some more questions that I didn't answer in today's video, or if something was unclear and you want some further explanation, please feel free to leave me a comment down below and I would be happy to answer it there. So with that said, if you did enjoy watching this video, if you found it helpful, please give it a thumbs up. Also subscribe to my channel if you're not currently subscribed, because I would really appreciate it. But either way, I just appreciate you taking the time to watch my videos. So thank you so much for that. And that is all I've got for you guys today. So again, thanks for being here, and until next time, enjoy reading.